countries as well. And very, very soon, I hope, certainly in 2021, that we can have these discussions and debates and visits face to face. But I'm going to maybe go to you, Pekka, first of all. Good afternoon to you there. I can see from we can have these discussions behind you and debates and visits face to face. You're in downtown Brussels I'm going to maybe at the moment. I'm sure it's a lot quieter than it usually is. But Pekka, just in relation to the Common Agricultural Policy, if we look at how it's shaping up at this point in time, there was a vote in the Parliament, in the EU Parliament, about 3, 4, maybe 5 weeks ago. It was heavily criticised by the environmental lobby that what is being proposed, it will not go far enough to actually make farmers and food producers more accountable for what they're doing when it comes to the environment. So maybe I'll just get your own, I suppose, analysis of the Common Agricultural Policy from a farmer perspective, because of course COPA represents farming organisations and cooperatives from across Europe. You're the umbrella body there. So I'll hand over the floor to you for the next few minutes, Pekka, and you're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Damien. And it's indeed a pleasure to be here today with you. And like I told you when we managed to tackle our technical challenges in the very beginning, I was in contact with a journalist that was not an agricultural specialist. And the big difference there is that you actually have to start from quite far away to explain how agriculture and food chain work. So thank you very much for the question. And in response to your question, what happened a couple of weeks ago in the Council and the Parliament is a very good illustration of the resilience and what the farming community and agri-food chain actually stands for. This is about evolution. This is about organizing things in a more sustainable manner in the future and built on and based on the existing structures, family farms, existing logistics, existing investment in industry, processing, trade, everything. We are talking about the biggest industry, biggest economic sector of the whole union. This is actually what Mr. Timmermans himself pointed out when he was commissioner, and also his predecessors from the previous commissions. They actually recognized the role of agriculture sector as such. But it's more to do with how we organize ourselves. And if we could do this in a kind of a hermetic, let's say, environment in the EU, we could close our external borders and decide administratively how much we pay for our food, then things would be much easier. Perhaps they wouldn't be politically easier, but then from agriculture point of view, it would be. But the question here is that how to develop this equation with the international trade and increased liberal trade across the world. Despite the recent developments in the United States, clearly the societies expect that we would have free trade across the borders. And the only big question for the European farmers is that how much of those standards are double-checked in the border entrances to the European Union and vice versa to our trade to third countries. How do those imported products compete with us? But it's very much about the process itself. I would like to point out that it was the common position of the Council, agricultural ministers, member states, and overwhelming majority of European Parliament members to support the compromise in each of these institutions. And now the discussion is based on these two institutional positions. And of course, the Commission is mixing this. And that's why it's a bit of a disappointment that Michael is not yet there, because he would have given us the starting line, the baseline for this debate. The Commission is actually pushing the other two institutions in a way that we haven't seen for quite a while. And there is no political mandate for this in general, because both the Parliament and the Council are very much in support of their own positions. And the Commission is not like intervening. And the key element here for us all, and especially what we have asked the Commission to deliver, is what we call impact assessment. If our US counterparts in the US administration has come up with a fairly critical report, I would only ask where do we have the European contribution to the same discussion? So if the three regulations that the previous Commission proposed in June 2018 have been now worked on for 2 years. And all of a sudden, we have to incorporate some communication level Commission initiatives on a direction, on objectives. How that would translate into actual legislative texts, and how this would be justified to these two institutions. So therefore, the minimum from our perspective, and I think we agree with the Council and the Parliament the same, is that we have an impact assessment, how we would see European own production develop, how would it affect our competitiveness, and how eventually that would have an impact on European farmers' income. And so this is, of course, from our perspective, crucially important, because we are there to make the necessary investments. And the fundamental part of this whole process was that we could go forward with the CAP proposal. It can be modified, let's say, fine-tuned, but we need to have consistency and long-term vision and horizon for farmers to make the necessary investment. We are in a very thin margin business. We are not in a let's say, high-tech sectors that would generate income and profit margins for the first 10 years and then cease to exist. We are supposed to be there for tens and if not hundreds of years. And this makes a completely different scenario for European Union policies. But we are very committed, and I believe that the COVID-19, like Damien, like you pointed out, is a good illustration of the resilience of European agriculture, but didn't come for free. It required millions and millions of people working hard to make sure that we didn't have any problems at the marketplace.
Okay, Pekka, thanks for that. I'm just reading back reports from AgriFacts dated the 24th of last month, the day after the votes, and I'm looking through the reactions from the NGOs, particularly the environmental pillar, and universally they slammed the vote as saying that it flies in the face of what the Green Deal is all about, and that it's bad for the future of farming in Europe, it's bad for trying to tackle climate change. How do you respond to that? Do they have a point?
Well, I would, if they refer to the Green Deal is a set of objectives, basically. It's not a true commitment to the European Commission to come up with the legislative initiatives to enable farmers to do that necessary sustainability work. And then I take two very good examples from farmers' perspective. European Commission has dragged their feet on what we call low-risk substances and their authorization to the marketplace. It's not a panacea. It is not a solution to all questions and challenges, but at least it would give us some assistance. We are very slow, and we are lacking. We are behind our competitors. And quite recently, the other area which may be controversial in the eyes of some people is what we call new breeding techniques. The Commission just waits for the reports to come out, and then we may come up with the legislative initiatives next year. And meanwhile, everybody else out there goes forward with these tools that would enable farmers in the EU to use modern technologies and make more resilient agriculture out of what we have already. And so we wouldn't have to use those chemical substances that everybody seems to hate so much. But the Commission doesn't enable us to do this. They are petrified. And this is what actually some of the Commission officials told us when we talked about, for instance, new breeding techniques. We cannot go forward. It would be devastating because the civil society doesn't accept this. So what are we talking about? Then we accept this in the imports. We accept this when we have pharmaceuticals. GMO is perfectly acceptable when it comes to pharmaceuticals, but we can't use these products when it comes to agriculture. And so the big question of how is missing from the European Commission communication on Green Deal, and especially the farm to fork and biodiversity strategy. It would be set of objectives that would be to be translated into action, and especially at farm level. And that piece is missing.
Okay, Pekka, if you can see a sense of relief coming across my face, it's because I'm delighted to say that we are joined now by Michael Scannell. Michael, good afternoon to you. And I know there was some technical issues beyond your and our reach, but look, it's better late than never to have you. We are absolutely delighted that you've been able to join us for our webinar today. And we have Pekka Pesonen, as you know, and also Asbjørn Borsting of FIFAC, who's waiting patiently, and we'll come to you, Asbjørn, very soon as well. But Michael Scannell is the Deputy Director General in DG Agri, and he's a former Director of the Food and Veterinary Office of DG Sante, formerly DG Sanko. And of course, there's no mistaking with a name like Michael Scannell that he is a proud Irishman, a fellow Irishman. So we're very happy that you're able to join us. So Michael, just to reiterate, I suppose the purpose of our webinar here today, where we're joined by almost 100 agri journalists from various guilds dotted throughout Europe, and of course the ENAJ is an umbrella body for all those guilds and associations. And what we're really wanting to know is, where are we now in relation to the Common Agricultural Policy reform? I know it's gone past the Parliament stage, but we'd like to hear from you. Where are we with CAP? What is at the centre of the reform? And basically, just to say what I said earlier on, how can we feed a growing global population safe, traceable, sustainable food that is kind to the environment, that is kind to biodiversity, but is also kind to farmer livelihoods and incomes? And is it compatible, the Common Agricultural Policy as it stands at the moment, is it compatible with the aims of the European Green Deal and the Farm to Fork policy within that? So, Michael, that's kind of the tone of our conversation, and I'll hand the floor over to you.
Okay, Damien, thank you. And I hope you can hear me okay, because I'm participating by iPhone. For reasons unknown, I wasn't able to connect to you on my computer. And I guess time is already running, so I'll basically give you an abbreviated version of what I had proposed to say. But you specifically asked for an update on where we are on the CAP reform proposals. Very briefly, you have to view those proposals in the context of the COVID crisis, the ongoing negotiations on the multi-annual financial framework, and the Green Deal. I'm not going to go into detail on the COVID crisis. It's still with us, although hopefully we're getting towards the end as these vaccines come on stream. The relevance of the multi-annual financial framework is that this, of course, will also determine the budget available for the CAP. Our heads of government arrived at a very good deal in July that made a very good provision for the CAP, better than the Commission itself had originally proposed. And in that context, they also agreed to supplement the CAP monies through the rural development funds to help address the problems arising from COVID. Now, as you're well aware, there are still some issues that need to be ironed out, nothing to do with the CAP, nothing with the broad architecture of the MFF, but it's the issue of the rule of law and the reluctance of a small number of member states to accept what the Commission and member states basically aim for in that particular direction. But bottom line, the financial framework is now almost in place to provide support to our farmers for the period 2021 to 2027. Turning to the Green Deal and Farm to Fork, the original CAP reform proposals were presented by the Juncker Commission before President von der Leyen entered into office. She has already made clear that the priority of her term will be climate change, that she's committed that Europe will deliver on its international commitments, i.e. climate neutrality by 2050. And in that context, she and the Commission agreed that the CAP reform needed to deliver agriculture's contribution to those efforts. Now, the proposals had already been made. They were made with an already high degree of ambition, but we needed to revisit the process to essentially reassure stakeholders that the CAP was fit for purpose in delivering on the Green Deal and Farm to Fork objectives. And there was a specific Commission paper in May of this year, basically elaborating on how the CAP can and will deliver on the Green Deal ambitions. It will require, let's say, some modification of the existing direction, but the Commission identified how that can and should be done. And by way of example, already this morning I was in a meeting with my Spanish counterparts to discuss our recommendations to Spain on what should be in its CAP strategic plan. The Commission will be publishing recommendations close to Christmas on the recommendations addressed to all 27 member states on how they need to ensure that their CAP strategic plans deliver on the Green Deal and Farm to Fork objectives. And now then turning to the CAP reform process itself, as you acknowledged, Damien, both the member states in the Council and the Parliament just 2 weeks ago agreed their positions on the CAP reform proposals across all three pillars, the CAP strategic plans themselves, the so-called horizontal regulation, which is effectively the financial and control framework governing the CAP, and the so-called common market organizational regulation, which deals with the operation of the markets. So both institutions are essentially have agreed how they perceive the reform should proceed. The issue now is how do you reconcile their different approaches, because while there's a high degree of commonality between the two, there are nonetheless divergences. And from the Commission perspective, how also we can ensure that there is a sufficient level of ambition in the emerging consensus on the CAP reform to deliver on the Green Deal objectives. Now, this will all take place in the context of the so-called trilogue negotiations. As I speak, virtually on a daily basis, we're meeting with Council and Parliament across the three pillars, technical meetings for formal trilogue meetings. And the hope and expectation is that we'll conclude this process early next year, and that will allow us then to basically nail down the CAP reform process. We've accepted, and this is more or less already agreed also, that there will be a 2-year transition period between the old CAP and the new CAP. During that period, the member states will make the necessary preparations. They'll submit their CAP strategic plans to us for our review and approval. And as part of that process, we'll obviously be looking very closely at the Green Deal dimension. And hopefully then that will allow, let's say, a fully reformed CAP to enter into force on the 1st of January 2023. As I say, that's an abbreviated version. You also asked me how do we reconcile all this with the demands on us to basically keep our population fed, on world population, basically new technologies, etc., and how we can reconcile the Green Deal with the growing demands on our food production systems. And yes, and I even picked it up in the couple of minutes that I was listening in before you invited me to speak, where Peter was speaking on difficulties in relation to, for example, pesticide use and new breeding techniques. The Commission is aware and knows and appreciates that the change of direction incumbent on us as part of the CAP reform process and the Green Deal will involve very important changes for our farmers. But we'll be there to help them in that process. I'm not going to go into huge detail on the revised CAP, but you're well aware of the so-called ECHO schemes, the new measures that will come on stream in terms of the European Innovation Partnership, the ACHA schemes to basically boost innovation and technology in the agri-food area. And I'd emphasize in that context also, because people look at the Green Deal only or primarily from the dimension of environmental sustainability. But if you take the trouble to read the detail of the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork, there are two other pillars, the economic sustainability and social sustainability dimensions, because the Commission fully acknowledges and accepts that sustainability will only work if it's attractive for farmers. And for it to be attractive for farmers, it basically has to allow them to earn a good living. It has to be practical, pragmatic, and basically implementable. And an awful lot of what we will be doing in the Green Deal and Farm to Fork will aim in that direction. So we don't expect only farmers to make their contribution, but consumers, for example, will have to accept that the price of food needs to take into account also the wider environmental and sustainability dimension. So that if this, for example, requires that consumers pay more for their food to reflect the fact that it needs to be produced increasingly to higher sustainability standards, well, so they should, and that will be a price worth paying. Similarly, retailers will have to accept that they have to play their role in promoting and facilitating a more sustainable food production system. So the Commission will be bringing forward proposals to basically ensure that they also deliver. There's also a very important international dimension, of which Pekka, I'm sure, will speak. We have to ensure that our farmers' efforts towards improved sustainability in the food area are not undermined by a reluctance or refusal of our international trading partners to be as ambitious as we are on sustainability. So there are a wide range of initiatives that will be taking place in that area also. So it shouldn't be viewed only from the perspective of the demands, and they're important demands, we recognize that, on our farmers. This effort will have to take place across society in general. But the bottom line in this entire process is that for the CAP to be credible, for it to enjoy societal support, for it to continue enjoying the public financing, basically it has to be seen to make its contribution to Europe's transition to a climate neutral economy. This is a point which my Commissioner and Vice President Timmermans continually emphasize, that essentially farming, agriculture have a contribution to make, but they also have huge benefits to reap. Farmers know at first hand that climate change is a reality. They see it on a daily basis in terms of major climate events, invasive and new plant and animal disease species, etc., etc. And so that to allow them to continue to produce in these more challenging environments, we essentially need to change direction. So, and that's what the entirety of the CAP reform process, in conjunction with these other policy areas, aims to deliver on. I think this enjoys wide societal support. It certainly enjoys the support of the member states. The heads of government have endorsed the broad Green Deal and Farm to Fork strategy. The agricultural ministers themselves accept that this is the direction we need to take. And I think farmers themselves accept this. It will require a big effort on all our part, but I think ultimately the benefits will be worthwhile. And I'm sure if we have time to go into the discussion or whatever, I hope to have an opportunity to outline to you some of those benefits. Again, my apologies that I say I have had to curtail my contribution somewhat, but hopefully that will give you a general flavour of where we are at this moment in time. And apologies again that I had to do this on a phone rather than on screen. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very much indeed for that, and no problem at all. It's a great overview that you've given us there, and it's great to have somebody in the high position that you're in there explain to us on our webinar today where we are with CAP. And already I know we've had some questions. We won't get to them all, but do send your questions through, and we'll certainly do our best to put them to our panelists. But at this point in time, for the first time today, I will come back to you, Michael, and I'll come back to Pekka as well. But first of all, Asbjørn Borsting is from Denmark. He's just been appointed elected as the new president of Fifa, which is the umbrella body for compound feed mills around and premix organizations and businesses across Europe. Asbjørn, you're very welcome to our webinar, and you've been listening there to Michael. I'd like to maybe get your thoughts.
Thank you very much. And I would like to start with a few words about the current market situation for the EU livestock sector. It is clearly worrying as all key livestock markets struggle, both to problems on domestic but also on export markets, while key raw materials have experienced a rally over the last few weeks as a result of what we could call a below average EU grain harvest and reduced ending stocks for key crops at global level. On the other hand, I'm also happy to say that the feed industry in Europe has shown strong resilience in maintaining essential feed supply chains without any serious disruption up until now during the COVID crisis. However, the crisis has shown again the strong dependence we have in the EU on some critical import materials. That's the case for high protein meals from the Americas, but also on some micro ingredients. That's the case for vitamins and other products from, for example, China. All in all, our estimate is that the total EU feed production will go down by 2% in 2020 compared to 2019. So that's the actual situation. I can also tell you that in Fifa, we have chosen a proactive approach to respond to the EU Green Deal targets by adopting a comprehensive EU Sustainable Charter 2030. It was adopted on our annual meeting recently, and actually we had both Michael Scannell and Pekka as keynote speakers, so thank you for your great participation. This sustainability charter have 5 key ambitions for the EU feed industry. Key ambitions which really fits into the Green Deal approaches. The 5 ambitions are: point 1, that's climate change and reduced greenhouse gas emissions linked to feed production. That's the first one. We have a second one, that's a circular economy covering the use of co-products and improve nutrient efficiency. The third one are responsible sourcing, focusing on what we are calling no deforestation or no conversion soy. The fourth one are animal health and welfare. And then we have the fifth one, that's what we are calling resilience of the EU feed production, looking at working conditions and on developing alternative protein sources. We are also aiming for the EU to maintain what we are calling a holistic one nutrition approach, focusing on sustainable nutrition goals all along the food value chain. That's a nutrition efficiency in plants, animal and human nutrition, in order to reconcile trade-offs and dilemmas between competing Green Deal targets. That could, for example, be between a too ambitious target on lowering the use of fertilizer in the EU, the norms for fertilizer. It could conflict against a higher EU import needs for proteins. We have also preparation for a revision of the soya sourcing guidelines we have implemented in Fifa in the first generation back in 2015. We are planning now to launch a new set of Fifa soya sourcing guidelines with a module of no conversion or no deforestation, and this is our plan to launch that in January. We are also working closely together in the sector and with the EU Commission and with universities and our American colleagues on developing a harmonized climate database. We call it the PEF-CR. And today we have around 1,500 data points for this harmonized calculation on environmental impacts on our feed production. I think it is very important that when we are going to measure our improvements in the climate-friendly feed production, we have to have a common toolbox to measure our improvements. I would also perhaps come with a few comments about the CAP reform. The feed industry is advocating to boost competitiveness of the production of homegrown vegetable proteins in the EU protein plan. It's a part of the CAP reform which we consider as very important. And we see at least 2 instruments here. One is to have some coupled support to protein crops. The other one, that is research and development. Pekka Pesonen mentioned the new genome techniques. I would maybe here state that in our discussions with the EU Commission, I think that the Commission is, and I hope that the Commission is planning for coming up with sustainable long-term proposals in the next spring 2021. We need to be able to work with these techniques in the European community in order to be competitive in our development of our plant varieties on the world market, but also in order to be able to have a free trade with other parts of the world. And here we are in FIFA clearly advocating for free trade arrangements. We are clearly in favor of supporting the initiatives from the World Trade Organization. We are looking forward to a more active American participation again. And we are in general also, I should state that, very much in favor of all initiatives to maintain a strong single market in the EU. So that's some short comments from my side. Thank you.
Asbjørn, thank you very much for that. And again, the very best of luck to you over the next 5 years in your job. Pekka, I'm going to come back to you. I know you've been in already when we began earlier, but having listened to Michael there now, your thoughts?
Well, of course, I have had the privilege to listen to Michael several times, and so frankly, I'm not surprised. He knows his area of policy preparation very well. But I would certainly ask Michael to give us the Commission view on the impact assessment. So if European Union Common Agriculture Policy post-2020 reform now in the trilogues should take into account the Green Deal, as is the common mantra, why wouldn't we get an impact assessment of that, the consequences of that inclusion to the common agricultural policy and what that would mean for food security, competitiveness, and farming income? Why wouldn't we get that and we wait for each pieces of legislation which will only come later?
Michael?
Yeah, well, I think we'd be putting the cart ahead of the horse. This issue was, to all intents and purposes, addressed in May of this year, when the Commission produced a staff working document which accompanied the Green Deal and Farm to Fork to explain why the CAP reform proposals already provided a sufficient framework to deliver on the Green Deal and Farm to Fork object, with obviously certain qualifications. For example, that member states and the European Parliament did not, let's say, step back on the level of ambition proposed by the Commission, on condition that eco schemes could be introduced, etc., etc. This working document also acknowledged that moving forward as the Green Deal and Farm to Fork proposals were presented, because frankly, both are strategies. They didn't present concrete proposals. What you really need to look at, for example, is to look at the annex to the Farm to Fork strategy, and you will see a list of proposed Commission proposals that will unfold over the next 3 years, with a commitment that each and every one of these proposals would go through the Commission's better regulation process, so that where, for example, they do present challenges, or where they would fundamentally have an impact on how we produce our food, etc., there would be an impact assessment, including a public consultation, etc., etc. And the Commission is still committed to that process. And if we find as part of that process that basically certain impacts were not fully anticipated, well, obviously we need to take that into account. You know, we can't overlook the sheer breadth and ambition and scale of the CAP. We're talking 387 billion over 7 years. You know, this is absolutely enormous. And there will never be a moment in time where everything is, let's say, perfect or fully synchronized. It's an evolving situation, and that's always been the way. We're never going to be in a situation where there are not new threats emerging, new risks, new developments. And that's why the CAP has been and will continue to be dynamic in adapting to new challenges, new changes. So to Pekka's precise point, of course we accept that these proposals, whether it's on pesticides, veterinary drugs, nutrients, landscape areas, etc., etc., as and when the proposals are presented, there will be impact assessments, and if lessons are to be learned from that process, they will be taken into account. But frankly, it would have been unacceptable to simply sit back and say, well, we'll do nothing unless and until these proposals are presented. the Commission basically has to take a lead on these issues. And of course, we're accountable. We will learn over time if essentially we have been, let's say, we've moved too far, too fast. But given the urgency of acting on climate change, we don't have that luxury. The Commission, President von der Leyen, my Commissioner, Vice President Timmermans, are very much on record. Basically, we need to move quickly, decisively. But we're confident that basically the framework is in place and we can accommodate these changes as they evolve. I'd suggest, for example, that people look at the CAP Strategic Plan regulation, because you will see in that there's a so-called Annex 11, and that sets out the various conditionality requirements that are set out in other pieces of EU legislation on, for example, pesticides, veterinary drugs, etc., etc. And it's accepted that that will be a dynamic process, as and when that legislation changes. So the provisions of this Annex 11 will change, and they will need to be basically built into how member states basically design their measures and how the Commission assesses them.
If I may ask a short question. Michael, could you comment the USDA report on farm to fork? Because the saying is that we need to incorporate Green Deal, not these specific pieces of legislation. We need to incorporate Green Deal. And USDA took a look into this. What's your view on the analysis?
Yeah, the USDA is one of a huge number of studies that are available and are coming on stream that will assess and evaluate the full impact of all these measures. And the Commission has already, it's a matter of record, it's online, our response to the USDA study. Frankly, ultimately, we'll work on the basis of our own studies. And here I get back to the impact assessments as they unwind, the ongoing work in the Joint Research Council, the work with our member states. But we're confident that we can adapt our food production systems to basically ensure that they're more sustainable without undermining, for example, our food security and food resilience situation. Because again, let's not forget, it's a formal and very important part of the Green Deal and Farm to Fork. Europe has to ensure that it has a high degree of food security. One of the formal proposals that will emerge in the Farm to Fork in the fourth quarter of next year, so relatively early in the process, is a communication on ensuring that basically we are resilient in the face of crises in the food supply chain, such as, for example, happened with COVID, where I would add our system has proven itself to be very resilient. We coped extremely well with a huge crisis. And I think it's to the credit of our farmers and our food supply system, even in a situation where we had a major pandemic with huge public health consequences, our food systems were able to continue to operate efficiently and effectively without any major disruption in supply. And that will always remain an extremely high priority for the Commission and our member states. We simply can't afford to take risks with food security. So whatever we do under the Green Deal and Farm to Fork will attach a huge importance to ensuring that essentially we are in a position to continue feeding our people.
Okay, we did begin late, so with your indulgence, I am going to propose that we just stay on air maybe for another 10 minutes, if that's okay. And I want to try and get to some of the questions. We won't get to them all, but thank you, everybody. And it's great. I recognize a lot of the names here, but I'm going to just throw a couple of questions and feel free to pass on if it's not your area to maybe one of the other guys. But Thomas Hubert, for example, asks, what is the latest you're hearing on the MFF, the Multi-Annual Financial Framework budget blockage? Michael?
You know, frankly, that's a little bit above my pay grade. Right. I did acknowledge earlier that essentially we were making great progress. The ballpark figures were agreed. Important changes were agreed to accommodate the views of the European Parliament. But there is this outstanding issue on the rule of law provisions, where a number of member states basically have problems with what is being proposed. And frankly, you'll read it in all the newspapers. It's in the media. It's in the trade publications. And I can't add any new or additional insights to that, except obviously it's extremely important that we get an agreement as quickly as possible, because this MFF isn't important not only for basically providing the funding for the EU, including the cap for the next 7 years, but it's also critical to the recovery package to deal with the COVID crisis. There's 750 billion of loans and grants, part of that package, which we can't unroll unless and until we have agreement. So the quicker it happens, the better.
Okay, just on that, by the way, there is another question. I can't remember who it's from, but just in relation to compensation for farmers for COVID disruption, is there a package there, Michael, specifically for farmers?
Well, you know, the COVID crisis is still with us, and we had a discussion in the Agri Council as recently as last week on the situation on the markets, and I've just outlined to you that our agri-food markets proved to be very resilient in the current crisis. And when you look, for example, at the damage that's been done to sectors like hospitality, aviation, travel, tourism, basically it's held up extremely well. And in large part, that's thanks to the cap, because we have supports in place. For example, the direct payments that provide farmers with a certain degree of resilience so that they can deal with fluctuations in markets. And we're also helped by the fact that basically demand for food is pretty inelastic. You know, you can postpone going on holidays, you can postpone buying a new car, but you can't postpone eating. So yes, there have been huge shifts in basically the patterns of consumption, because obviously restaurants are closed, etc. People are eating an awful lot more at home, and that obviously has an impact on what they're eating and how they're eating it. But overall, the overall level of demand has held up quite well. Yes, we did have to intervene in certain areas, and we did earlier this year with, for example, private storage aid for beef, skim milk powder, butter, cheese, etc., etc. We had to provide a lot of flexibility in various cap measures, including direct payments, bringing them forward. We introduced measures to allow for more flexibility on unspent rural development money, so it could be diverted towards farmers, etc., etc. And we have certain legal ongoing obligations under the cap to intervene as and when there is an impact on the market. But the conclusion from the council negotiation, the discussion last week, and I stress this took place by video conference, which, as we know, has a lot of disadvantages. But the overall review accepted that markets had held up well and were continuing to do so, but there were certain sensitive areas. For example, pig meat has suffered, in part because of COVID, but also because of the ongoing problems with African swine fever and problems with access, for example, for German pig meat on Asian markets because of the recent outbreaks there. Poultry is suffering somewhat. Wine for obvious reasons, the closure of the hospitality sector. Certain other sectors are doing extremely well. The crop sector prices are doing very, very well. Some exceptions, for example, sugar, fruits and vegetables doing rather well. We had a meeting of our market observatory on citrus just yesterday, and prices doing extremely well. So the situation is quite variable across the different sectors, and indeed there are differences by member state also. But the overall prognosis was that, say, the system is proving to be resilient. And I stress, you know, that's in large part due to the strengths of our cap. And what I do regret, which we all regret, and the Minister for Agriculture, my Commissioner certainly regretted it, is that the strength of the cap in ensuring that we have a very resilient agri-food production system that keeps us fed, even in times of crisis, is sometimes it doesn't get the recognition it deserves, and it's not always appreciated as much as it should be. Or to put it a little bit more bluntly, it's too often taken for granted.
Okay, another question here from our friend Mickey Goodfredson in Helsinki. Hello, Mickey. He wants to know, he wants to hear something about Brexit. With or without an accepted agreement between the UK and the EU, might it complicate the timetable for the upcoming cap? Are they separate, Michael?
You know, we're faced with a huge number of challenges at this moment in time. You know, it basically, we have a conflux of different crises, and Brexit and how it finally emerges being one of them. But, you know, certain things are certain. The UK from the 1st of January is a third country. The transition period ends. The entire cap reform process has already factored that in. So that won't change. So the impact of Brexit on the cap reform process, frankly, we don't expect any fundamental impact in that context. As I say, it's already taken into account.
Okay, Michael, I'll give you a little bit of a rest, but you can come back in after this if you wish, because I have another question here from Nicolette Dragomir. Hello, Nicolette. Good to have you. I think I'll put this to you, Pekka. What is the European Commission's future positions on GMO crops? For example, GMO soy. We import and consume it, but we do not produce it. I'd be interested just to get the COPA position on that.
Well, you should ask the Commission representative how they feel about GMO. I already said that they seem to be petrified, and the former DG of Michael, DG Sante, actually they know this all too well. And of course, there's a good number of high-profile professional people who understand the logic of the technology and how these products are basically safe. Otherwise, they wouldn't be allowed in our food chain. But it's very much about the impact in cultivation that European Union is looking into. We have a bit of a double standard there when it comes to imports, because as you know very well, we import a good number of GMO crops, which we do not cultivate here in Europe. We still have only, I think, tens of thousands of hectares max GM crops in the EU, which is a marginal product. How this would develop, frankly, my personal expectation is that European Commission would need to have a look into what we call new breeding techniques. The recent Nobel Prize is a clear indication that the European Union simply cannot ignore this. These technologies will spread and they will be used by our competitors, and they will enter the European Union market irrespective whether we want or not. And the unfortunate thing in this respect is that we cannot control them. While in the GMO, we can actually detect, at least in most products, agros or commodities typically, we can detect these GM traits. But there's no way that we can detect something that would happen over the years naturally. So it simply doesn't work like this. And so we would expect that the European Commission would have to deal with this one way or another. We recognize the political difficulty, but then our international trading partners will force us eventually to make our mind.
Okay, Asbjørn, I'm interested in your position on that, on GM.
Yes, I fully agree with Pekka here. As we see it, things are already developing all over the world among plant breeders. We have some crops on the market in the group of what we are calling new genome techniques. And as Pekka is saying, most of these NGTs, we are not able to detect them. So it will be impossible for us to have our trade relation maintained with a lot of countries outside the EU without aligning to the kind of approval of these NGT-based products, which our main trade partners are having. And I also think that from a competitive point of view, there's so many potential improvements in our crops, both concerning sustainability in environmental and climatic direction, but also, of course, in the direction of more classical yield, that without using these techniques in Europe, our European-based plant breeders will not be able to bring forward on the European market crops which makes us able to have a more sustainable agriculture. For example, new protein crops that can compete better in yields under our climatic conditions. It is simply necessary that we are acting rather fast here. And I will not blame the Commission very much for the current situation. We all know that it was some more legal consequences of decisions in the French court systems, but I think the decision-making process in Europe really have to act rather fast now in order to bring us on stage with what's going on all around the world here.
Okay, I have a question here. I'm just going it's in relation to animal welfare. I think it's from Elena Bloom, who's saying, what are the future plans or proposals? And it's specifically asking the Commission and COPA, our two representatives, for your opinion on it. So, Michael, what is the EU position in relation to animal welfare? I know there are standards there and farmers must obey them, but are there any changes in policy coming down the road which farmers need to know about and respect?
Yes, I think if you look at the CAP reform proposals, the conditionality requirements, they will become more stringent, including in the area of animal welfare, which hopefully farmers will not have a problem with, given that the overwhelming majority basically love their animals and take very good care of them and are very conscious of the need for high welfare standards. In parallel, of course, we will have the eco schemes coming on stream, and hopefully member states, farmers themselves will see opportunities for using them to promote higher welfare standards. Now, I have to add the qualification that policy for animal welfare within the Commission lies with my colleagues in DG Santé, but if you're following developments in the Agri Council, you'll have seen that there have been quite a number of discussions, including under the current German presidency, on how the Commission can or should bring forward new initiatives in this area. There are a number of proposals in this respect in the farm to fork communication. So basically, it's what I said earlier. People will have to be, let's say, be patient because in the fullness of time, the Commission will be forthcoming with new proposals in this area. Labelling is another issue, obviously, which is becoming much more topical in relation to welfare. And again, the German presidency has been driving this particular issue on how you might capture through a label or otherwise the additional efforts which farmers are prepared to go in the area of animal welfare, because hopefully consumers will be prepared to pay higher prices for higher standards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and look, we're going to wrap very shortly because I know people have to get away. We were a little late starting, so that's why I've just continued on, and we'll probably go for another few minutes. But I just want to go back to you on that, Pekka. You know, the demands from consumers in relation to animal welfare standards, environmental standards, they're increasing all the time, as we know. Diets are changing, particularly in Western countries anyway, as we know, more focused towards a plant-based diet, and in fact it's very much part of the Green Deal. So where does COPA stand on the issue of animal welfare on farms? Is there more that farmers could be doing there to convince consumers that that they are implementing best practice when it comes to animal welfare? Pekka? Maybe you should unmute after that long-winded. Yeah, okay.
My apologies. Like Michael said, everybody's let's say motivated to take good care of the animals, and of course the big driver there is that if the animal is not well fed and healthy, you wouldn't get a proper outcome of the process. It doesn't actually deliver. Also from economic point of view, it doesn't make any sense. But then I think I won't add anything particular in terms of the technical approach to what Michael said, but I would like to point out the need for transparency. And this is where the big data, blockchain, digital services would come handy, because the consumers are interested where the food comes from. But then the reality is that they don't have the certainty where it actually originates and what can they assume when they consume, for instance, livestock products. I come from Finland, as you probably know, and we have had this labeling of eggs. And that is something that the consumers are quite committed, and they actually see this as an added value to the product. But then that needs to be also reliable. And that's why the transparency, modern technologies, video screening, or you name it, we have nothing to hide. And in this respect, we expect that there will be some movements forward for the enhanced animal welfare, even beyond the standards. If the consumers are interested in paying, they will most probably get the service. But that's exactly the point. when we have products entering European Union market that certainly do not fulfill the same criteria, especially in animal welfare. That would be a huge disadvantage for European farmers. By the way, I would like to point out in relation of Brexit, we would be very much interested in the follow-up of the Brexit process from the UK animal welfare perspective, because the UK NGOs, civil society, and also to a certain extent various government has been very promoting animal welfare in the EU. How this would be organized now in the new situation with the UK government is negotiating free trade agreements, especially with countries such as Latin America and United States. I still have 7,500 personalized postcards in one of the offices here, urging me from the UK to go forward with animal welfare standards. But as you know, Mr. Johnson actually didn't give that much weight to these standards of the British farming. And that is really killing our NFU members in the UK. So it would be really interesting to see how the investment in the UK farming would develop on the basis of the government decisions facing more open market with international competition.
Okay, guys, I know you've been very kind with your time, and I'm going to draw this webinar now to reluctantly to a close, because I've found it quite interesting, as have all of our participants. Thank you to everybody for asking questions. Don't blame me for not getting to your question, but we do thank you. And I know, Pekka, you were answering some of the questions there yourself in the chat. But before we finish, I'm just going to ask all three of you maybe to give us maybe a 1 minute, 45 second or 1 minute take home message. And I'll go back to you, Asbjørn, as we sign off here. Just from a FIFAC perspective, where we are in relation to CAP and looking into the year 2021, from your perspective, what is your take home message to our journalists across Europe today?
My take-home message would be that these impact assessments and the total balance should be maintained in the European CAP reform. I also think that we have to look into all the research and development initiatives, because we have to improve our investments in agriculture and food research and development in order to fulfill some of the high goals and to tackle some of the dilemmas we see in the Green Deal proposals.
Okay, back to you, Pekka.
Well, a lot has been already said. I'm not going to repeat anything else than of course, the impact assessment is crucially important for us, because that's also the communication tool for the Commission to say that this is the overall impact on us, and this is what we are supposed to take care of. This is crucially important. But then I would like to add one element that I feel very, very passionate about, and that is what share of the consumer euro will remain on the farms. So how much of this added value will maintain there? And when we talk about these famous back to basics, and our commissioner, Mr. Wojciechowski, is one of the big promoters of this, to go back to smaller farms, more extensive farming methods, how much can we keep of that added value, and does it actually make that farming family living? And that is crucially important in terms of the future policy framework. We can talk about this, and personally, I'm more than let's say interested in developing this. But how much can we keep of that consumer euro back to the farm basis in return of the more sustainable products?
Okay, and Michael, I'm going to just ask you for your final thoughts, but I'm going to ask you a question as well, because we just have one more that has come in here. I'm going to put to you. It's from Liviu Gordia in Romania. Liviu, I know you're anxious that we get asking this question. So how realistic is establishing a carbon sequestration market for farmers in the near future? Do you have a view on that, Michael?
On that specifically, the Commission has already produced a working document on eco schemes, and one of the 4 strands that we identify is carbon farming. And again, if you read the detail of the Green Deal and Farm to Fork, there's an explicit acknowledgement there that there's a huge role to be played by farming and forestry in parallel in relation to carbon sequestration, that basically agriculture can absorb huge amounts of carbon. And that needs to be recognized, and farmers need to be given opportunities to basically provide services to society in that direction. So yes, when I spoke earlier about the Green Deal and Farm to Fork and the Reform CAP presenting new opportunities for farmers, that's one of them, and a very important one.
Okay. And again, just to finish up, Michael, what is your message to our participants here as we finish up the webinar?
I think farmers are now in a much stronger position in society generally. Until very recently, and it's what I said earlier, in recent, people tend to take food security somewhat for granted. Farmers were basically seen as carrying out a rather, let's say, basic service, providing food. Now, however, not only are they expected to provide food, but they're expected to provide extremely important and valuable services like animal welfare, sustainability, climate mitigation, etc., etc. And I think farmers can quite legitimately ask in that context, well, you know, once upon a time you paid me for the value of my food, but now I produce all these other services at your insistence and at your demand. And the prices I receive for my food should reflect these additional services. And we need to see farmers evidence that basically Green Deal, Farm to Fork, climate mitigation measures, and the CAP reform process basically ensure that we get the recognition that we deserve for providing a very fundamental service that goes well beyond just providing basic food. So they're in a much strengthened position.
Okay, all right. Well, Michael, on that note, we're going to leave it. I want to sincerely thank you, Michael and Pekka and Asbjorn, for your time here today. We really do appreciate it. I know there's a lot of demands on you, but it's been great having you on our first ever ENAJ webinar. And please pass on our thanks to your staff as well, who we've liaised with over the last week or so. All it remains for me to do is say thank you to everybody for participating. As I said, I have many friends all across Europe. It's great to see many recognizable names there. And please God, very soon we'll all be meeting again at various places throughout Europe. But I'd also like to thank my fellow committee members for their work in organising this event. And to finish, and I'm going to leave the last word, if he's still there, appropriately enough, I want to go back to our chairman, Hans Siems, to wrap up at this webinar. But for the moment, from myself, Damien O'Reilly, to all of you out there, thanks so much for participating. I do hope you got some stories from and quotes from our participants today. And my apologies, we didn't get to all of your questions, but I think we covered a lot of ground over the last hour and 15 minutes or so. So I'm going to hand over now to finish up and to wrap up to Hans.
Okay, Damien, thank you. You wrapped up the whole webinar of us in a better way than I can do it. It was a great adventure for us to do it. It was a great webinar that we can follow. We had a lot of aspects coming around the CAP, around the Green Deal, Farm to Fork. It was a lot that we had to discuss, and I hope that we can have the speakers of today in next webinars of ENI, because I think the journalists are having a lot of good information to get this evening or this afternoon, but they are full with questions that they have and that they will ask in the next webinars. Thank you very much, speakers, for your contribution, and I want to thank the moderator, Damien O'Reilly, and Adrian Bell on the background for helping us to do this great webinar. Thank you very much, and get home soon at home, or if you're not at home, do it, and we see you. Bye.
Thank you very much, and keep writing about agriculture.
Yep.